Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for tuning in to Kallipolis Radio. Today, I'll be reading a short story by R.M. Dobbelsteyn. This story is titled, Footfall. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our channel members, Joshua Anolik, Torritz, Catherine McMillan, Dink Smallwood, Ronnie Limestone, and Dapper Clown. If you're interested in joining the channel, you can find more information linked in the description below. Thanks for listening. A pair of boots clattered on the sidewalk, intermittently pausing as their wearer glanced up to catch the numbers of the buildings that he passed. The click of his boots sunk away into the bustle of the street as he halted in front of 9722. The sound of two suitcases hitting the pavement rippled out into the street. A further click of boots and the rap of knuckles on a wooden door. It creaked open seconds later. A woman, no older than 35, appeared in the doorway, the wear of working years written onto her face. "Morley?" she asked through a smile. "The same," replied the man. "Well, don't just leave your bags out there. Come on in." The door swung open fully, and Morley passed inside, breathing out a slight laugh as he maneuvered awkwardly through the door. "Beautiful building," he said. "Old but sturdy, you know." "Oh, I'm familiar." The two chuckled. "Well, there's not much to show you. Living room is there, kitchen is there. I sleep in the room off the kitchen. Storage is in the basement. Floor 2 and 3 are all your new tenant friends. Rent is due on the first of every month, no excuses, and I make a hot breakfast every day for 7, but lunch and dinner are on you. Call if you need anything," the woman said, gesturing around as she spoke, firm but with a smile of pride on her face. "And which room is mine?" "Second floor. Should be the only one with a door open and nobody in it." "Well, thank you again very much, Mrs. Sinclair." "That's Miss to you. Mr. Sinclair got himself dead a few years ago. God rest his soul." "Oh, I'm sorry to hear that." "Shouldn't be. Now get your bags out of the hallway. I got a house to keep," Miss Sinclair said with a smile as she shooed Morley up the stairs. He made his way to the second floor and found himself on a small landing. The floor was merely a hallway that stretched from one end of the old house to the other, 6 doors branching off and leading to small rooms. At the far end of the hallway, Morley could see a small pool of light spilling out onto the floor from one of the doorways that stood open. He approached the doorway and thought he could hear some shuffling about from inside the room. Peering around the doorway, Morley saw a short, prim, anxious-looking man fiddling with something in the center of the bed. "Pardon me," Morley said, and the man shot up and spun around with a start. "I might have the wrong No, oh my goodness, no. My apologies. I didn't expect you so soon. Dylan. I am Dylan. You are not. You are the new tenant. Well, I certainly promise you I wasn't up to anything bad. Quite the opposite. Just leaving you a little, might we say, welcome present? Miss Sinclair was telling me you were a bit of a scholar. I was thrilled. I'm Dylan, if I haven't mentioned it. You could consider me the welcoming committee here. Anyway, this is yours. If you could return the book when you're done, much obliged, then maybe I thought we could discuss it." The short man was practically screaming parts of his flustered torrent of words, and at the beginning of his ramblings had clapped his hands behind his back and puffed his chest forward like some proud schoolboy reciting his memorized homework. "I'm Morley. Nice to meet you, Dylan." Morley smiled awkwardly and stepped into the room, setting his bags on the floor. The room was old, much like the house, and furnished simply with solid wooden furniture. A bed, a desk, a chair, and a dresser. That was all. For its sparse furnishing, the room was large. Being a corner room, the 2 windows included the north-facing one that let in plenty of light. "Could use a lamp," Morley said as he looked around. I'll find you one. Don't you worry," Dylan said proudly, pointing a finger up to the ceiling to emphasize his point. "Oh, the Iliad," Morley said with a smile. He had noticed for the first time what was left on the bed, a copy of the Iliad perched up against a bag of chocolate and a bag of salt and vinegar chips. A neatly sealed white card fronted the whole of the package. "You're familiar," Dylan said with near exultation in his voice. "Very, actually. I was a classics minor in school. Here, I have my copy with me." Morley rarely had a chance to talk the classics with anyone, so he indulged Dylan for a moment, regardless of how strange he was. He fished his old and heavily handled copy of the Iliad from one of his bags and handed it over to the man, who handled the book with a gentleness that seemed alien to his character. "Wow. Quite marked up, isn't it?" Dylan said with a smile, running a hand over the heavily annotated and noted pages. "Yeah, I've read it once or twice." "Well, I'm very glad you're here then. The current residents don't have much time for books," Dylan said with a hint of sadness, closing the book and extending it back towards Morley, who took it and deposited it on his new desk. "Well, I'm sure we'll be friends then. I would like to unpack, though." "Oh, yes, of course. I do have a bit of a habit of overstaying my welcome. My apologies. I'm the first door on the right on the 3rd floor if you ever need anything," Dylan said, again returning to his nigh shouting awkwardness. He bolted out of the door as he spoke, with a walk that somehow felt like a run, but he stuck his head around the corner of the open door. "Or if you would just like to hang out." "Sounds good," Morley said, waving at Dylan as he heard his footsteps vanish away down the hall and skitter up the stairs. When the house had fallen briefly silent again, he picked up and gently tore open the letter sitting against the small collection of snacks. It was a brief few words, scratched in ink onto the small white slip of paper. "Welcome to the house. Dylan, Miss Sinclair, and company." Morley smiled gently at the note and placed it on his new desk. He opened the small bag of chips and began to munch on them absent-mindedly as he strode up to the window of his room, which led out onto the empty lot next door. An overgrown lot of weeds, dirt, piles of construction gravel, and miscellaneous bits of trash. Beyond that, an old apartment building occupied the end of the block. He unlocked the window and lifted the creaking, cracking contraption, letting a cool spring breeze into the room. Opening his bags, Morley sorted his scant few possessions into their new homes in either the dresser or onto the desk, and as he worked, he noticed that the floors were not too solid, and he could hear the footsteps of his upstairs neighbor walking about. He would have preferred to live on the top floor and have no one above him, but the footsteps were light, nothing hit the floor, and Miss Sinclair seemed to run a tight ship. So he assumed there would be no issue should the noise become too much and he was forced to complain. Having few possessions, the unpacking was quickly completed. Morley then made sure to locate the bathroom for himself and find where the best place outside was to smoke. The first afternoon in the new rooming house passed uneventfully. Morley occasionally heard the sound of his upstairs neighbor, the pattering footsteps of what he assumed was Dylan bustling to and fro about the house, and the sound of Miss Sinclair sweeping the hallways and tidying the kitchen. As he quickly came to learn, the house was entirely occupied by men, and nearly all of them worked during the week, so the house remained fairly deserted during the day. It was only as 6 o'clock rolled around, and the inhabitants of the house began to trudge their way home, that the house truly came alive with grumbling, laughing, coughing, talking, and chattering. Morley was about to place his hand onto the doorknob of the bathroom when the door swung open and he was face to face with a startled man. He looked about the same age as Morley, either ending his 20s or beginning his 30s, but the yellowed teeth, bagged eyes, and heavily tanned skin betrayed a less than ideal state of health that was likely aging him beyond his years. His clothes looked like they had taken a beating, his hands were rough and calloused, and his hair had evidently seen sweat in lieu of a shower that day. "New guy," the man said, pausing. "That's me." The two stared at each other awkwardly for a moment. The tap leaks all the time. It's not a you problem," the man said, as he stepped to the side and cleared the way. "Thanks." As Morley passed back down the hallway, he passed the room before his, which had the door fully open. A sharp "Hey!" jumped out of the room as he crossed in front of it. Turning his head, the man from the bathroom sat in a chair, his feet, with muddy boots still on them, kicked up onto the bed. A small nightstand, looking as though it was barely clinging to life, stood next to the bed and supported a lamp and a freshly opened bottle of whiskey. "Hi." Morley stopped. "I'm a bit awkward when you catch me pissing. Name's John." "Oh, don't worry about it. You can call me Morley." "Well, welcome to the house, Morley. Looks like we're neighbors." "Yeah, looks like it. You want a drink?" Morley checked his watch, but for no reason in particular. "It's Friday," John said, holding out his whiskey bottle and shaking it by the neck. "If you don't want to drink out of the bottle, go find a glass." I'll be right back," Morley said, briefly returning to his room and grabbing his travel mug off of his desk. As he was turning to leave the room, he paused to look at the desk chair and thought back to the muddy boots kicked up onto the bed. He grabbed his chair and carried it next door. "Oh, Mr. High Class brings his own chair," John said with a straight face as Morley returned. Morley gave a polite chuckle. He placed his chair down so that he sat facing the same way as John, towards the one wall in the room that had anything on it, a collection of Playboy centerfolds affixed to the wall with peeling electrical tape. "What? You ever been to an art gallery? Place is full of tits. Look, I got the Mona Lisa right there," John said, catching Morley looking at his art collection. The two men made eye contact, and a brief silence possessed the room before the two burst out laughing. It was a laugh born from the cutting of tension and not the quality of the joke. John reached over and splashed a healthy amount of whiskey out of its plastic bottle into Morley's travel mug. They knocked their containers together and both took a swig. The whiskey was wretched and nearly made Morley gag, but he managed to suppress it, feeling his face screw up into a swirl and his chest glow with heat. "It's cheap, but it gets the job done," John coughed. It does," Morley sputtered out through contorted lips. "So you just move in today?" "Yep," Morley coughed. "Nice. It's a good place for how cheap it is. I've been here 2-3 years? I'm not sure." John shrugged. "Yeah, Miss Sinclair seems nice. Guy Dylan, is he always like that?" John barked out a laugh. "Yeah, little weirdo." He took another swig of whiskey. "So what do you do?" "Sales." "Cool." "It's not." "Make decent money?" "Yeah, I'm not the worst at it." "Why live here, then?" "It's cheap. I'm saving up to marry my girlfriend. Take her around the world, too." Morley smiled over his travel mug. "That's cool. I do roofs." "Like, you build them?" "Build them, fix them, whatever they ask me to do." "It's hard work?" "Yeah." Morley finished off the whiskey in his mug, and John filled it up again. The liquid left a rancid taste in his mouth, but a familiar and soothing taste in his brain. "Do you smoke?" John asked. "Occasionally." "Yeah, call it an occasion then." The two stood up, John capping his whiskey bottle and stuffing it in the pocket of his battered flannel coat. They plodded their way down the stairs and tossed a quick hello to Miss Sinclair, who was bustling about in the kitchen. The screen door to the backyard squealed open, and the two crossed the threshold onto the back porch. John handed over a cigarette, and 2 small gouts of fire sprung up in the spreading twilight of the evening. "So, anything I should know about living here?" Morley asked after a minute of silence. "Nah. Pretty much everyone works construction or trades, except Dylan, who does, fuck if I know, some book shit. Miss Sinclair lives off the rents." "It's cool." "Yeah, place is good. You'll probably like it." The two finished their cigarettes in silence and went back to John's room, who asked Morley if he played cards. He answered in the affirmative, and the two passed that Friday evening in playing cards, finishing the bottle of whiskey, walking out to buy another, and casually chatting more as the liquor steeped further into their brains. Morley awoke in the vague haze of an even vaguer hangover, and shook it off with a quick trip to the bathroom and the kitchen, one to empty his bladder and the other to fill his stomach. There were remains of a breakfast prepared by Miss Sinclair, and a half-full pot of coffee keeping watch in the kitchen. Morley heaped a plateful and sat himself down at a long table in the adjoining dining room. "Oh, your first breakfast from Miss. Prepare to enjoy yourself." Looking up, there was the head of Dylan, peeking around the corner of the dining room. He beamed a smile and disappeared back behind the wall. Morley stared for a moment, and Dylan reappeared with a cup that let off faint wisps of steam and radiated the smell of coffee. He sat himself down at the table directly across from Morley. "You met Mr. John last night, I hear." Dylan smiled. "How'd you know that?" "Thin floors, thinner walls. Alcohol makes one loud." So it was unintentional, was it? Certainly, Morley grunted. I did think you and I would get along more than you would with the, Dylan leaned in and spoke quietly. Brutes that make up the tenants of this place. It's been one night. Well, yes, I suppose that's fair. Look, I've an idea. Morley raised an eyebrow over his breakfast. How about you stop by my room tonight? I'll fix you a drink far better than the one that John could ever make you. Sure. Excellent. First door on the right, third floor. I'll see you there, Dylan said, jumping up from the table and nearly running out of the room. He hadn't taken a single sip of his coffee. Morley had finished his breakfast, downed his own coffee, and the untouched one of Dylan's, and then proceeded to walk about for what must have been a good 2 hours. The exercise and the caffeine, settling themselves on top of a full stomach, served to rouse him out of his whiskey-induced fog, and set him back on his feet in the world of the living. As he returned home, the house was a bit of a bustle. Some men smoked outside, others were sitting in the living room watching TV, and he crossed paths with John on the stairs, who looked as though he had just woken up. The man nodded to him, and Morley continued to his room, shutting the door behind him and dropping onto his bed. A quick nap found Morley awake again at 5, and now, feeling fully refreshed, he rolled from bed and crossed the room to stretch his legs. The house below him was bustling with the sounds of various dinners being made and consumed, but he noticed that the man above him was plodding around his room again. He ate a handful of chips from a rolled-up bag sat on his desk, and, checking the time, figured now was as good a time as any to pay his promised visit to Dylan. Trooping up the stairs, Morley found that the third floor was a bit more neatly kept, with a lower, slanting roof and a floor that creaked more than those in his room did. Dylan's room was the only one with a door open, and he stepped inside to find the man bent over his desk scribbling something into a notebook, a pile of papers and open books scattered about in front of him. Morley noticed that the rooms on this floor were bigger than the ones on his, and he later learned that, as such, the top floor was reserved for long-time residents. But the room was so sized that it fit a queen-sized bed with plenty of space on either side, a large desk, 2 bookcases full to bursting, a table with 2 chairs, and a bar against the wall that was fully stocked with bottles and equipment. "You came!" Dylan said, sitting bolt upright in his chair with a look of excitement flashing onto his face. He shoved himself from the chair and rushed over to the bar. "I said I would, didn't I? Well, words don't always mean much from folks." "Nice room." "Thank you," Dylan beamed, as glasses clinked and liquid poured. "Yes, it's my little sanctuary in the world, you could say, or from the world, depending on how you see it. Anyhow, have a seat." Morley sat at the table, which was washed by the evening sun as it fought its way through the old and dirty glass. He saw Dylan finish whatever he was making with a final flourish and whisper, "Perfect," to himself. He turned around, but holding only 1 glass. "For you, my friend," Dylan said, setting the glass down on the table. "None for you?" "No, I don't drink," Dylan said, seating himself with a sigh. "That is a very full bar for someone who doesn't drink." People are more willing to talk to me if I provide them free liquor." "Yeah, works for weddings, I guess." Morley shrugged and took a sip. His eyes opened wide. "This is amazing. I'm glad you like it. What is this?" "Family secret," Dylan said, leaning over the table with a smile. "Lots of gin, though, if you want a hint. Dad's favorite." "Whatever it is, it's fantastic," Morley said, having already finished half the drink. "Drink as much as you like. I have plenty." Dylan waved a hand, then sat back somewhat in his chair. It was odd to see a man this frenetic have even a hint of relaxation in him. "So, Morley, tell me about yourself a bit. I always like a bit of biography on a scholar before I take them to task on anything academic." "Well, let's see," Morley said as he downed the rest of his first drink. Dylan immediately sprang to fill the glass, but motioned with his hand for the conversation to continue. Not much to say, really. I mean, I like to read. I'm saving money right now. I work in sales. That's about it." "How simple. You know, in a good way," Dylan said, waving a stir stick around with one hand. "What are you saving money for?" "An engagement ring." A full glass was gently placed on the table in front of Morley. He sipped. And some world travel. Any particular woman in mind? Dylan smiled. Yes, Morley chuckled. I've never met someone who I've known for a fact I could spend the rest of my life with. She she makes me want to do things I never had a desire to do before. I never thought I would leave this city, or get married for that matter. Now? Well, I mean, here we are. That's lovely. Very glad for you, Dylan said, leaning back in his seat. Love sure is a confusing thing, isn't it? Nothing more powerful, Morley drank. Nothing scarier. Janus, if you will. Exactly, Morley shouted, a bit louder than he expected, finished his second drink, and slammed the glass back onto the table. Dylan moved to refill it. Nothing better has ever happened to me in my life, and I've never been more afraid than I am now. He drummed his fingers on the table. It's like I'm carrying a chest full of gold on a tightrope, and I've never walked on a tightrope before, ever. Interesting metaphor. A full glass hit the table, slopping a puddle of gin over its rim. Imagine if you found some sort of mythical stone that made you happy, gave you purpose, made your life better. Wouldn't you be constantly afraid of losing it? Well, make it transmute base metals, and it sounds like you have the Philosopher's Stone. That's what it feels like. So, what philosophers have really been seeking all of these centuries past was just the right woman? It feels that way. Well, she must be very special. Special would imply that she can even be put in the same category as anyone else. She can't be categorized. Above it all. Poetic. Sure. An empty glass hit the table. There are surely other ways to abate your fear of loss, Dylan smiled. Morley swirled his glass around in circles on the table. Like smoking? They both chuckled. End of the hallway has a small balcony. No need to go downstairs. Thanks, Morley said, rising and pulling a half-crumpled cigarette pack from his pocket. He regained his feet with a bit of a tremble. When he returned to the room, his glass had been refilled again. Neat little house this is, Morley said, sighing as he sat down. Certainly. How long you been here? A while. I don't really keep track, Dylan said. He brushed one hand over the surface of the table. What's the worst that could happen? What? What's the worst that could happen? Dylan repeated. With what? Your tightrope walk. Oh, Morley smiled weakly. If she left, I guess. Why? I don't know what I'd do with myself. Do you know what to do with yourself now? Morley paused a moment, swirled his drink about, and took a sip. No. Dylan raised his eyebrows quickly, but said nothing. I guess the worst ending is she leaves, I lose all the motivation she gave me, and I die here, drunk and alone and broke. So the motivation is hers, not yours. Well, no, but I suppose she's the reason? That which comes once can come again. It's a latent potential of you. She didn't give you anything, just prodded something that you didn't know that you had. I guess. Dylan paused for a moment, staring at Morley, who began to grow uncomfortable with his gaze. Anyhow, that's morose. Tell me your favorite book, Dylan said, a smile returning to his face as he sat forward in his chair and placed his hands on the table. Morley drank, shook himself, and pulled out of reflection into literature, the two losing themselves in the conversation as the night sped by, the sun sank, and Saturday became Sunday. When Morley awoke, he had no idea where he was, and his head swam. He existed in those brief few seconds between regaining consciousness and the brain remembering the pain it was in, and he cherished them, as brief as they were. He opened his eyes and took a moment to remember what his own ceiling looked like. He was in his bed. He reached for his phone, but it was nowhere to be found. Rising, it took him a moment for his feet to stabilize and his body to feel like it was in his control again. The house was silent. He pulled a pair of pants on, stumbled against his desk, and walked bleary-eyed to the door to make his way to the bathroom. In his hungover state, Morley stopped in the hallway for a moment, confused. He had opened and shut his room door, and swore for a moment that it was louder than usual. He returned to his room after a voyage to the bathroom, and once again, the door was louder than it usually was. He assumed it was his head causing a sensitivity to noise and stepped into his room. He had crossed half the room and stopped again. His footsteps seemed louder too. Morley stopped and looked around the room. He made for the window, unlatched it, and slid it open. This, too, louder than it normally was. The fresh air brought him back to life for a brief moment, and he walked across his room to his desk. But no, the footsteps, the window, the door, they weren't louder. They were happening twice. Morley slowly raised his eyes to the ceiling. He waited. Nothing. He took a long step forward. His foot made a soft clump on the floor. A soft clump came from above him at exactly the same moment. Morley shook his head and blinked rapidly. Okay. He went back to bed. Morley woke up what he assumed was hours later. Though he had never checked the time when he had gone to the bathroom earlier, so he based his judgment on how long his sleep felt. He thought of his bizarre dream from earlier and rose from bed, stretching and rubbing his eyes. He walked halfway across his room towards the door and froze. There they were again. The man in the room above him was walking across his room in the exact same place at the exact same time as him. "Fuck you," Morley mumbled to himself, rolling his eyes. He made it to the door and yanked it open. He heard another set of identical footsteps and the sound of a second door being opened. The footsteps didn't follow him into the hallway as he made his way to the kitchen, gulping down 4 glasses of water and making coffee for himself. He returned to his room, searched everywhere for his phone, but couldn't find it. And the whole time, the man upstairs mirrored his journey exactly. He would pull his desk chair to the side, and he would hear another chair scrape the floor above him. He would sit down on his bed for a moment, and he would hear a bed squeak ever so softly above him. He would shift a pile of books on his desk. He would hear the faint shuffling of paper upstairs. "All right, what the fuck?" Morley said, both to his missing phone and his upstairs neighbor. He made straight for Dylan's room, eyeing the closed door of his upstairs neighbor as he reached the 3rd floor. Dylan's door was open when he got there. The man was sat at his desk, reading. "Good morning, my friend," he said, looking up. "Phone is on the table." "Thanks," Morley mumbled. He walked over to where he had sat the night before, wiped his phone screen, and returned the device to his pocket. The phone was at 100%, Dylan, evidently, having charged it. "Did you sleep well?" Dylan asked. "I slept long." Dylan smiled. "A question for you," Morley asked. "Yes?" "Who else lives on this floor?" "Well, aside from me, there's Miss Sinclair's nephew Chris, and there's Charles." "Which one lives directly above me?" "That would be Charles." "Why? Too loud?" Something like that." "Mention it to Miss Sinclair. She'll talk to him. She keeps a strict house when it comes to noise upstairs." "Okay, thanks." Morley turned and made to leave. "It's very odd," Dylan said. Morley stopped in the doorway. "What? Why?" "Charles is quite old, if my memory serves correct. Can't imagine him making much of a stir." Morley didn't respond, and he left the room. Morley spent the day in his room. Every time he moved, he heard Charles move around in an identical mirror of him, and he wondered to himself what the hell the old man up there was doing, and why exactly he thought it so funny to annoy him in such a weird way. When he began to grow hungry later in the evening, he made to leave to get something to eat, and he passed by Miss Sinclair alone in the kitchen. He mentioned to her that Charles was being loud in his room above him, and a puzzled look came over her face. "That's very strange for him," I'll pop my head in there tonight. Thanks for telling me," she said, smiled, and turned back to the dishes that she was doing. "Thanks," Morley said, tapping the side of the doorway twice with his hand before turning to leave. When Morley returned home from dinner, finally clear of his hangover now that he had washed his food down with a few beers, he returned to his room and found, to his annoyance, that Charles still mimicked his movements around the room, although now they were quieter. The following day, being a Monday, Morley spent the day out of the house. He returned around 6 p.m. to a home bustling with activity. He said his hellos to those milling about in the common spaces, and he headed for his room. As he passed by John's room, the door of which was open, John called out to him with a quick, "Hey!" He held out a whiskey bottle by the neck. "Drink?" John asked. "Maybe. Let me get my shoes off." "Okay." Morley opened the door to his room. Stepping in, he heard the familiar, echoing mimic of Charles above him. He grumbled and threw his bag onto his bed. Turning around, he made his way straight back to John's room. "Yeah, fuck it. Drink," Morley said, waving a hand dismissively. "Mondays, huh?" It's actually the guy above me." "Loud?" "No, not exactly." Morley leaned forward. "He, copies me? Every time I walk across the room, he does the same thing. Walks across his room. I open the window, I hear him open the window. I move a chair, toss a bag, cough, anything. He does the exact same thing." Morley drank straight out of the bottle. "The fuck?" "I know, right?" "Who is he?" "I don't know. Dylan said he's some old guy. It's not annoying. I don't even know what to do. It's just so weird." "Do I talk to him? Do I talk to Miss Sinclair?" "Pretty fucking weird to me. I'd go bang on his door." "He could just be bored." "Could be. How's he know what you're doing?" John asked. "What?" "You said he does the same shit you do. Can you tell fuck all what's happening in the living room below me right now? How does he know what you're doing?" He hears me?" Morley trailed off. His stomach was in the basement of the house now, and he felt like he was going to vomit as he took another drink of the whiskey. He felt lightheaded. The things that Charles did, they didn't happen after Morley did something. They happened at exactly the same time. How did he know what he was doing? "Yeah." John had a smile on his face that said, "Thought so." "Come on," Morley said, stumbling quickly to his feet, almost slamming fully into one side of the doorway. "Careful," John muttered lowly, jumping up after him. The two ran over to Morley's room, where Morley leaped at the corners of the room, digging his fingernails into the cracks of the walls, searching frantically for a camera. He threw books around, overturned his desk chair, ripped all the bedding off his bed, even unscrewed the light bulbs from the fixture on the ceiling. John stood in the doorway watching. He gazed up at the ceiling, and he heard from upstairs a commotion mirroring that which Morley was making. "Is everything all right?" came a voice from the hallway. John turned his head and saw Dylan standing on the stairs to the 3rd floor. John waved him over with a concerned look on his face. Morley had spent his energy tearing the room apart, and now fixed his eyes on the two men. "Move," he said as he pushed through them and headed for the stairs. "That may not be the best idea," Dylan said as him and John hurried after Morley. Morley crested the top stair and walked straight for the room above his own. He grabbed the door handle and twisted it violently. It was locked. He swore to himself, then began to bang on the door with his fist. "Hey, cut this shit out. I don't care if you think it's funny or what, but you can go fuck yourself. Turn off your fucking camera and leave me the fuck alone." Morley screamed, hammering his fist on the door to accentuate his words. But the banging sounded too loud for one man's hand. From inside the room, a fist hammered on the door back at him. Morley did not seem to notice. "Okay, let's go," John said, coming up behind Morley and grabbing him by the shoulders, pulling him away from the door and pushing him towards the stairs. Doors in the house had begun to open, and various feet were heard in the stairwell as the residents investigated the commotion. John ushered Morley into his room and shut the door behind him. Morley sat on the edge of the bed, John and Dylan sitting across from him. He drank himself into oblivion that night, the two men keeping him company. There was no knock at the door from Miss Sinclair, and no inquiry from any of the other tenants. Morley woke up in time to call in sick to work, but that was all that he could muster before falling asleep again. He slept deep, and he slept long. When he finally rose, it was to the sound of heavy footsteps in the house and a general stir that seemed odd for a weekday. He sat up at the sound of crackling radios and booted feet somewhere inside the house. When the thought that this might be the police entered his mind, he bolted upright in bed and threw the blankets away. Jumping up, he quickly pulled on some clothes and sped into the hallway. He saw the back of a paramedic descending the stairs to the main floor, carrying a stretcher with something laying on it, covered in a black bag. He rushed upstairs. Throwing open Dylan's room, he found the man sitting at his desk, reclining in his chair and reading. "What happened?" Morley said, catching his breath. Dylan looked up slowly, and a warm, sympathetic smile crept across his face. It was a look that Morley had never seen him give before, and didn't even think it was possible from him. "Go look," Dylan said in a calm, soft voice. Once again, so unlike anything that Morley imagined his personality could produce. He turned around slowly, for some reason filled with a deep and abiding sense of dread. The door to Charles's room was open. Morley slowly and mechanically stepped across the hallway. He peered into the room. It had no inhabitant. The room reeked of alcohol and cigarettes, as though someone had washed the floors with vodka for years. The room was furnished just like his, save with the addition of a bookcase packed to the brim. Bottles of liquor crowded the desk and the top of the bookshelf, a motley collection of every kind, brand, and size, the only unifying feature being that they were empty. Morley stood there for a moment, unsure what to think. "Did I give him a heart attack or something last night?" he mused. As he looked around, his attention was caught by a book on the nightstand. The Iliad, an incredibly battered and tattered copy at that. He stepped gently over and picked it up, revealing another book underneath, a leather-bound journal. Setting the first book down, he lifted up the second, flipping the worn leather open to reveal the first page. Property of Charles Morley. His stomach dropped. He sat down on the bed, which had a familiar creak to it. Morley rarely went by his first name anymore, but there it was in full. He hadn't mentioned anything when he learned that the man above him had the same first name as him, though he did find it a strange coincidence at the time. Charles Morley. The man above him had the exact same name as he. He opened the journal. He must have been fixed there on the bed for hours, unable to pull away from the horrific book that he held. It was his life. It was him. The same job, the same building, the same woman that he loved, but it was all the worst possible version of events. He had lost his job, lost the woman he loved, lost the will that kept him going. All he had left was his journal and his memories. The book was an outline of the worst and most horrific life that Morley could imagine. And there it all was, in his hands, a life that could be his, or a life that would be his. Finally, he fixed on the final entry, which was dated to just 2 days ago. "There's a new tenant in the room below me. It's very strange, but he copies me. Every time I walk across the room, he does the same thing, walks across his room. I open the window, I hear him open the window. Move a chair, toss a bag, cough, anything. He does the exact same thing." Morley let the journal fall on the ground. He felt like he was dreaming. He slapped himself in the face and stood up, walking as if in a trance out of the room. He stopped in the doorway and turned around, drinking in the stench, the sorrow, and the desperation of the room for one last horrific, confusing, nightmarish time, before he stepped into the hallway and softly shut the door. He had to talk to Dylan, to ask him what he knew about this old version of himself. The strange, enigmatic, shifting Dillon. Of course, he would know something about the old and mirrored version of Charles Morley. What the hell kind of a house had Morley just moved into? He looked behind him at the open door of Dillon's room and saw soft light spilling out into the hallway. He couldn't move. He turned back to the door he had just closed and opened it again. Dusty chairs and old boxes filled the room. Most were sealed with dry and peeling tape. Some were open and displaying contents that would have had a perfect home in an antique store. It looked as though nobody had touched any of it for years. No bed, no books, no bottles, no smell. There was a bar against one wall and held only a solitary bottle of gin, which looked as though it had been sealed for decades. Morley gazed silently at the room and shut the door.